Why is Obi-Wan waiting to train Luke? Just what is his game plan? After all, every day he waits is another day Vader and Sidious have to become even more powerful, and another day the Empire has to tighten its grip on the galaxy. So why at the beginning of A New Hope is Luke already 19 years old and has yet to even start his Jedi training under Obi-Wan? Now, we obviously know that's just the way it has to be. It was always going to be difficult for the prequels to give answers to certain questions brought up in the original trilogy, like why Obi-Wan never started to train Luke, for example. And when George Lucas created the prequels, I'm not so sure it was his top priority to seamlessly blend them into the originals. I'm not saying he did a terrible job, but there are certainly gaps and issues. Because if you think about it, if Jedi had always been trained from a very young age, basically starting shortly after birth, and in The Empire Strikes Back, Yoda even complains that Luke's too old to be trained, well, why didn't Yoda just take Leia and train her on Dagobah, and why didn't Obi-Wan just take Luke and train him on Tatooine or anywhere else for that matter? Again, that's not what the original trilogy established, and in defense of George Lucas, I'm sure when he was writing and creating A New Hope, then just called Star Wars, he wasn't worried about how he was going to go back and make a prequel trilogy some 20 years later and explain everything. He was just worried about making one good movie that people enjoyed. And don't worry, George, you did make a good movie. Okay, so can we find an answer as to why Obi-Wan didn't start to train Luke other than that's just how it has to be? Well, if you've been reading the new Star Wars comic books from Marvel, which are canon of course, you know that Uncle Owen has forbid Obi-Wan from training Luke, and that's been enough to stop Obi-Wan from pursuing the matter. Now, one could ask at what point does the fate of the galaxy start to outweigh the wishes of an uncle, especially one with no blood ties to Luke and who had only very briefly met his stepbrother Anakin during Episode 2. In fact, I think the argument could be made that Obi-Wan is far more family to Luke than Owen could ever hope to be. Obi-Wan basically raised Anakin, Luke's father of course, from the age of 9 on up. And then don't forget what Obi-Wan said to Anakin after their duel on Mustafar had ended. "You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you." And especially if you've watched the Clone Wars animated show, you know how true that is. That once the Master-Padawan relationship had ended, the two had become best friends, like brothers even. So it could be argued Obi-Wan is more like an uncle to Luke than Owen could ever hope to be. So what has Obi-Wan been doing in the meantime then? Again, the comics have given us some answers, and he has indeed been looking out for Luke, even saving his life on a couple of occasions. But other than that, pretty much nothing. They don't show him doing or talking about any type of training to become a Force Ghost, which Episode 3 in Clone Wars told us would be required of him. Instead, he seems to no longer think of himself as a Jedi, which makes sense because he does tell Luke in A New Hope that he was once a Jedi. We also know he hasn't used the lightsaber in years in fears of drawing attention to himself, and then in turn Luke. Though he does use one briefly at one point to save his life and the life of Uncle Owen from a bounty hunter. He is pretty much resigned to being the old hermit we see him in Episode 4, which all begs the question, why not just start training Luke despite Owen's wishes? And that kind of brings me to something else I've always wondered about that also seems to get touched on a bit in the comic books. What exactly did Obi-Wan say to Owen and Beru the day he dropped Luke off? Was it as simple as, "Hey Owen, remember that Jedi stepbrother you briefly met a few years ago? Well, here's this kid, can you watch him for me?" Or did Obi-Wan get into some of the nitty-gritty details about what had happened to Anakin and why it was so important Luke be kept hidden and safe? Now, as I said, the comics do touch on this a bit, because Owen seems to know that Obi-Wan was, in some way, responsible for Anakin's death and doesn't want the same to happen to Luke. Owen also seems to know that Luke leaving Tatooine would be very dangerous for the young man, which brings us to A New Hope and Luke wanting to go off to the Imperial Academy. As you'll likely recall, now that the Lars homestead has two new droids, R2 and 3PO, Luke wants to go ahead and transfer his application to the Academy this season and get his ass off of Tatooine and follow in the footsteps of his friend Biggs. Owen scoffs at this idea because the harvest is coming up and harvest is when he needs Luke the most and wonders why he just can't wait one more season. Now, sure, likely Luke is needed, but is this Owen's way of stalling Luke's departure from Tatooine, which he knows will ultimately get him killed? However, it leaves one to ponder how long Owen can keep pulling this until Luke just says screw it and leaves anyway. We even learn in the comics that he's run away from home before. So perhaps Owen will ultimately have to tell Luke the truth to save his life and send him off to Obi-Wan to be trained. What's also interesting about this scene is the conversation Owen and Beru have after Luke storms off. To me, it seems Beru knows nowhere near as much as Owen does about Luke and his father's past. She even seems to advocate Luke leaving in the scene when she talks about how all his friends have gone and it means so much to Luke. Owen then says something about how he'll make it up to him next season, likely just to end the conversation for now. But Beru then says how Luke's just not a farmer because he's got too much of his father in him, which I don't think is something she would say so lightly if she knew some of the truth about that father. Owen then says, "That's what I'm afraid of," and the scene ends. Again, maybe hinting at the fact that Owen knows more than we may have first assumed, and certainly more than Beru knows. Now, if you're watching this video, and especially if you've made it this far, you've likely seen Star Wars a time or two, or 20 or 100, and you know how the story goes. But let's change one tiny thing leading up to the story we all know and love, and see how that would impact events to come. And what's that one tiny detail? Well, let's go back to when C-3PO and R2 are escaping the Tantive 4 after it's been captured by Vader's Star Destroyer, the Devastator. Two Imperial gunners notice the escape pod the two droids are on and are about to destroy it when one tells the other to hold his fire because there are no light forms and it probably just short-circuited. Now, what if the first gunner would have destroyed it anyway? Or what if the second would have told the first to destroy it just to be safe? So in other words, what if R2 and C-3PO had been blown to smithereens right there and then, along with the message for Obi-Wan and the plans to the Death Star? How does this change everything? Does Luke ever get trained? Does he instead secretly leave for the Academy and get discovered by Vader that way? Is the Death Star ever destroyed, or is the rebellion instead crushed, even despite their uplifting victory at the Battle of Scarif? What happens to Leia? Is she executed? Does Han ever become anything more than that smuggler we meet in the cantina in Mos Eisley? Well, if you want to know what I think the answer to all these questions are and more, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll be happy to make a follow-up video that discusses an alternate reality of the Star Wars universe we love. Also, I want to give a big thank you to Gregory B for giving me the idea for this video and for his thoughts on a lot of the answers to the questions I just brought up. Like so many of you, he always has fantastic thoughts and insights that I look forward to reading, hopefully as much as you look forward to my new videos. And if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe button. If you are already a subscriber, then thanks for your continued support. If you'd like to know when I upload new videos, then hit the notification button or just follow me on Twitter. And as always, thanks for watching.